When you think of the first Europeans to set foot on Australian soil, your mind probably jumps to Captain James Cook planting the British flag at Botany Bay. It's the story many of us were taught, a tale of redcoats and Union Jacks that feels like the very beginning of modern Australia. But what if I told you that story is missing its first, and maybe most important chapter? What if I told you that another European superpower had already landed, charted the coastline, and even named the continent over 150 years earlier, only to decide it was completely worthless and sail away? This is the story of a lost opportunity, a different name for a continent, and how a Dutch no paved the way for a British yes. For centuries, European mapmakers had dreamed of a mythical great southern land, Terra Australis incognita, that they believed had to exist to balance out the landmass of the northern hemisphere. It was a geographical ghost, a theory just waiting for an explorer to prove it real. But the first documented European to actually find it wasn't searching for a new continent. He was looking for profit. And what he found would convince his nation to leave the great southern land to the ghosts for another century and a half. Before we begin, if you love uncovering hidden, dramatic moments from history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with your thoughts. It really helps us bring you more stories like this one. Long before any European sail broke the horizon, this continent was anything but unknown. It was, and is, home to the oldest living cultures on Earth. For over 60,000 years, hundreds of distinct and sophisticated nations of indigenous peoples thrived here. They navigated, cultivated, and understood this land in ways the arriving Europeans could barely comprehend. They had complex societies, economies, spiritual beliefs, and knowledge systems woven into the very fabric of the continent. At the dawn of the 17th century, it's estimated that as many as 750,000 people lived across Australia, belonging to over 500 different groups. This wasn't an empty land, a terra nullius, as later colonists would claim. It was a continent bustling with life, history, and culture. The story of European arrival isn't the beginning of Australia's story, but a dramatic, and often tragic, interruption. The year is 1606. The Dutch Republic is a global maritime superpower, and its mighty trading arm, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, is obsessed with the riches of the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia. Sent from Bantam, Java, with orders to explore New Guinea for gold and trade, Captain Willem Janszoon steered his small ship, the Duifken, or Little Dove, southwards. In February 1606, he made the first documented European landfall on the Australian continent, on the western shore of the Cape York Peninsula. But there were no spices here, no gold, no great cities to trade with. Instead, Janszoon and his crew were met by a harsh landscape and fierce resistance from the local Wik people, who were rightfully defending their land. After a violent clash where several of his men were killed, Janszoon turned back. His report to the VOC was grim. He described the land as swampy and its people as wild, cruel, black savages. He hadn't even realized he'd found a new continent. His charts marked the coast as just a southern part of New Guinea. Janszoon's disappointing voyage didn't stop the Dutch. In fact, it was just the beginning of their accidental relationship with the great southern land. The VOC had found a faster route to the Spice Islands, riding the roaring 40s winds across the Indian Ocean before turning north. But navigation wasn't an exact science. Turn too late, and you'd slam right into a massive, unknown coastline. That's exactly what happened in 1616, when Captain Dirk Hartog, sailing off course, landed on an island off Western Australia. He left behind a pewter plate nailed to a post, the earliest physical proof of a European presence in Australia. Over the next few decades, a string of Dutch sailors would chart almost two-thirds of the continent's coastline, the west, north, and south. In 1642, the legendary explorer Abel Tasman sailed south of the landmass, proving it was an island continent, and in the process, discovering Tasmania, which he named Van Diemen's Land. On their maps, the Dutch gave this vast, mysterious land a name, New Holland. But for all their mapping, the Dutch never settled. Why? The answer is simple: profit. The VOC was a corporation, not a government chasing imperial glory. Its only goal was making money. And every report that came back from New Holland said the same thing. This place was worthless. The coasts they saw were arid, windswept, and seemed sparsely populated. There were no obvious resources to exploit, no spices, and no major populations to trade with. To the Dutch, who were laser-focused on the immense wealth of the Indies, New Holland was a commercial dead end. It was a barren obstacle on the way to where the real money was. And so, they left it alone. For over a century, New Holland remained a giant, mostly ignored landmass on Europe's maps. The Dutch knew it was there, but they didn't want it. That all changed in 1770. A new global power, Great Britain, was on the rise, and it sent one of history's most famous navigators, Lieutenant James Cook, on a scientific voyage into the Pacific aboard HMS Endeavour. After observing the transit of Venus and Tahiti, Cook sailed west, determined to see if the eastern coast of New Holland, the one part the Dutch had never mapped, was any different. In April 1770, he sighted the southeastern coast of Australia. As he sailed north for the next 4 months, charting the coastline, what he saw was dramatically different from the Dutch reports. He found well-watered land, lush forests, and inviting bays. He named the region New South Wales and, on Possession Island, controversially claimed the entire east coast for Britain. Ironically, even Cook wasn't totally sold on its commercial potential, writing in his journal that it didn't produce any one thing that can become an article in trade. But the British had a very different problem than the Dutch, one that made this distant land suddenly seem very attractive. Britain was in social upheaval, and its cities were overflowing with people convicted of petty crimes. For years, they had sent these convicts to their American colonies. But after the American Revolution, that was no longer an option. Britain's prisons were packed, and rotting prison ships called hulks were becoming a public health crisis. The British government needed a new place to dump its unwanted population. Suddenly, Cook's New South Wales seemed like the perfect, faraway solution. So, in January 1788, the First Fleet, 11 ships carrying over 700 convicts plus Marines and officers, arrived at Botany Bay under Captain Arthur Phillip. Finding the bay unsuitable, Phillip moved the settlement to a nearby deep-water harbor he named Sydney Cove. This was the start of the British penal colony, a society founded on crime and punishment on the other side of the world. The early years were a brutal fight for survival, as the colonists faced starvation on unfamiliar soil. But their arrival was far more catastrophic for the continent's original inhabitants. The declaration of the land as Terra, land belonging to no one, was a legal fiction that ignored indigenous ownership and sparked immediate conflict. Introduced diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, to which indigenous people had no immunity, tore through communities. Some estimates suggest death rates in certain areas reached as high as 70% from smallpox alone. The destruction of traditional lands for farming severed ancient connections and led to starvation. This was not a peaceful settlement. It was an invasion that ignited a long and bloody period of frontier wars. Indigenous warriors like Pemulwuy of the Eora Nation led fierce resistance against the invaders, fighting to defend their lands and way of life. But they were ultimately outmatched by the settlers' superior firepower. The impact was a catastrophe, causing a massive decline in the indigenous population and marking the beginning of a long and painful chapter in Australian history. This complex and often brutal history is a critical part of understanding the Australia of today. If you found this story of New Holland compelling, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell for more hidden histories. The story of Australia's first European encounters is a tale of two empires with two very different goals. The Dutch, driven by a hunt for profit, saw a barren wasteland and turned away. The British, driven by a desperate need to solve a social crisis at home, saw an empty solution and stayed. It's a powerful what-if of history. Had the Dutch found the lush eastern coast first, or had they been motivated by empire instead of just profit, the continent might have remained New Holland. The course of Australian history and the lives of millions would have been profoundly different. The Dutch may have named the continent, but it was the British, with their fleet of convicts, who would ultimately define its modern identity, setting in motion a legacy of conflict, survival, and transformation that continues to shape the nation to this day.